Okay, so the semester will move quickly. We already have our first test next class. I just wanted to say something to all my classes as a kind of general piece of advice. When doing a multiple choice test, pay no attention to how many letters you answer for different things. I have seen students write on the back of their tests like formula to make sure they have an equal number of the different letters. I strongly recommend that you not do that. So today we're going to be speaking about chapter 8, which is on emotions and motivation. But before that, I'm going to cover a handful of terms that I realized I forgot to cover last class. And by the way, if you don't hear it in my voice, I'm a little under the weather, so hopefully I don't say anything more unhinged than usual, but apologies for that. So the first thing I forgot to cover was the concept of skew. This relates to a term that we did cover, which is outliers. So remember that the mean, or the average, is very sensitive to extreme values, or outliers. If you draw it as a distribution, this is one way that outliers can look. So you have a few values who are really far out here in the positive direction. This would be an example of positive skew. There's two ways to remember that. The simple way is look at where the long, skinny tail is pointing. Right? It's in the positive direction. That's positive skew. Another way to think about it is to think about which way the mean will be dragged. It looks like most people are around here, but the mean might show up somewhere like here, right? Because these extreme values will drag it forward. So we would say that's a positively skewed distribution. And then, this obviously would be an example of negative skew, where there are a few extreme low values that are dragging the mean in the negative direction. If a distribution is perfectly normal, or at least as close to perfectly normal as possible, the mean, median, and mode should be the same. But in cases of skew, the mode will be here, right? It's going to be the most commonly occurring score, and the mean will kind of be dragged out. Any questions on the concept of skew? Okay, the other thing I forgot to talk about, in the textbook it's talked about after the replication crisis. This is another issue in contemporary psychology that there's been growing effort to address. I will say probably not as successfully. This is harder to deal with, and that's, or at least more expensive to deal with, and that's the weird problem. So WEIRD is an acronym for Western, educated, industrialized, rich democracies. Most studies in psychology are done with samples from weird countries. In fact, it's worse than that. Most studies in psychology are done with university psychology undergraduates from weird countries. So, psychologists are cheap. So often we just recruit, our own students. Like, for example, you have the opportunity to get course credit for participating in studies. But this is a big problem because it turns out that psychology undergraduates from weird countries are not a representative sample of humanity. So there were a number of findings in psychology that were well replicated, but some clever people pointed out that all of the studies were done in these kinds of samples. So you look at China or India or sub-Saharan Africa to see if you see the same pattern, and often you don't. So there's a growing emphasis on trying to replicate patterns in other countries. And this shows up in places you might not expect. So you might think, for like moral values or cultural beliefs, doing this kind of replication would be important. But it even shows up in things as basic as visual perception. So here's an example. How many of you have seen this before? It's a commonly used visual illusion. Okay, so ignore the kind of half triangle bits on the edges. Look at the lines in the middle. Which line appears longer, A or B? Show of hands who thinks A. Who thinks B? So usually there's like a small number. So this is the Muller-Lyer illusion. So if you go home and look this up and use a ruler, you'll find that they're exactly the same length. Now you might think, that's just a basic feature of our visual perception. Surely this wouldn't be influenced by cultural experience. But in fact, if you go to non-industrialized countries, like countries more like closer to a hunter-gatherer type society, you tend not to find this bias or this illusion. And the reason is, the bias seems to emerge from being exposed to things like this throughout your life. So in this case, the line is closer, and in the further away case, the line is further away. So your brain gets used to adjusting and assuming that the second line is longer than it appears because it's further away. But there are not a lot of right angles in nature. So if you don't grow up seeing this, if your visual system is not trained on things like this, you tend to not experience the Muller-Lyer illusion. So that reinforces the idea that doing cross-cultural replication is very important. Okay, so those are some things I missed from chapter 2. Any questions before we start chapter 8? Okay, so as I say, chapter 8 is on emotions and motivation. And I'll start by addressing a belief that you'll find at least implicit in fields like philosophy. And that's the belief that emotions are no good and we should try to get rid of them or suppress them and just use pure reason. This is a very tempting view if you're working from within a certain tradition, but it is, to put this in movie terms, I've never seen Star Trek, but some philosophers hold up the ideal of someone like Spock, just pure reason and lacking in emotion. But in fact, this is not an ideal. Reason is just a tool. It's a tool for calculating, that kind of thing. It doesn't supply the ends or the goals. It's emotions that make us care about things. There's a quote from a philosopher, kind of contrary to others in the philosophical tradition, David Hume. David Hume once said, "Reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions." Passions meaning emotions. It's emotions that make us care about things and supply the goals. All reason can do is help us achieve those goals. So emotions are very important. So while I was in graduate school, I actually took an entire class on the history of emotion theory. Very controversial subject, lots of different approaches to conceptualizing emotion. But in that class, I discovered there's one thing that probably all contemporary theorists of emotion agree on, and that's that emotions are multi-componential, meaning multiple components. They're kind of a cluster of different reactions and processes that go together. And what we'll see is that different theories of emotion will emphasize different components, but the fact that emotions are multi-componential is now pretty close to universally agreed to. And the section starts off by talking about some of these components. So, emotions are states that include physiological activity. So things like fast heart rate, sweaty palms, teary eyes, things like that. There are various bodily reactions. They include behavioral tendencies. So part of what it means to be angry is you are disposed to do things like yell and hit someone. So they include dispositions for behavior. They include expressions, right? So they often result in different kinds of nonverbal communication, like facial expressions. And another component that's been emphasized in recent decades is emotions include a cognitive component. Cognitive meaning having to do with beliefs, thinking, representations of the world. So for example, to experience fear, part of what it means to experience fear is that you are evaluating that there's danger present. That's part of what a fear response involves. That's not meant to be exhaustive, but those are some of the components involved in emotion. As I say, different theories will emphasize different aspects. A term that's used in the book that relates to that last component is appraisal. Appraisal refers to the cognitive element. To appraise a situation means to evaluate or interpret it in some way. So if you appraise a situation as dangerous, that's typically a component of fear. Okay, so now we'll go through some of the historical theories. These nowadays would be considered incomplete, but they are each kind of picking up on different important components of emotion. So one early theory, it actually goes back to Wundt. I don't think you need to worry about that for the test, but how many of you remember Wundt from 1100? He's like the first psychologist. So he conceptualized emotions as being existing in two dimensions. And those dimensions are, the two dimensions are arousal and valence. Arousal and valence. So arousal here does not mean specifically sexual arousal. Arousal throughout the chapter is used broadly to refer to any heightened state. You could be excited, angry. These are all states where you're kind of high energy, if you like. So one dimension is arousal, ranging from high to low. And the other is valence, ranging from highly positive to highly negative. Valence here referring to kind of the character of the experience. Is it a pleasant experience or an unpleasant experience? So we then have four quadrants. In this quadrant, high arousal, high positive valence, this would be something like, being excited. You're a kid at Christmas. So you're high energy, but it's a pleasant emotion. So emotions like that would go here. Low arousal, positive valence. You're sitting at home watching TV, tired from the day, eating good food. You feel very calm and content. Pleasant emotion, but low arousal. A number of different emotions would go here. One obvious case is anger. So if you're really mad at someone, that's high arousal, or you're in a heightened state of energy, if you like, but it's an unpleasant emotion. Something like, someone tell me, what's an example emotion that would go in the last bucket? Low arousal, but negative valence.
Depression?
Yeah, something like depression, right? You're very low energy, sad, gloomy, slow, and it's an unpleasant, obviously, experience. Okay, any questions about this way of carving up emotion?
High arousal and negative.
So for the depression one would be low arousal and negative.
How about high arousal?
You're asking what's in here? Yeah, that's something like anger, being afraid would also count if you're really scared, right? Your heart rate's going fast, but it's an unpleasant emotion. Okay. Next, there are 3 different theories. These are, again, all sort of historical ones. None of these would be considered complete by today's standards, but they're historically important, so it's good to know them. These 3 each have to do with the relationship between emotions and physical activity. So remember I mentioned that emotions typically involve a bodily reaction. Each of these 3 theories is about what the relationship is between that bodily activity and the experience, the subjective experience of the emotion. The first one is the James Lange theory. So this is another name from 1100. This is William James, the founder of the school of functionalism. James was very strongly influenced by Darwin. So this theory is very simple. The bodily reaction happens first, and it causes the experience of the emotion. James says basically that to experience an emotion is just to become aware of the bodily reaction. This is a very counterintuitive theory. This means that, let's say to be afraid, it's just to have your heart rate go fast and then to become aware of that. That's it. So heart rate going up comes first, and then the subjective experience of emotion. And if that sounds strange, like I said, it is counterintuitive, but that's what these 2 gentlemen argue for. Another theory is the Cannon-Bard theory. This one says that the bodily reaction and the emotion occur simultaneously. You don't have to know this for the task, but for whatever it's worth, they thought that the thalamus did the kind of early processing of sensory information and would, quote, decide whether this was something dangerous, something pleasant, or what have you, and it would separately cause bodily reactions and the subjective experience of emotion. So it sends signals to the cortex saying, feel afraid, and signals to the heart saying, beat faster. So they occur roughly simultaneously. Now, a problem with these 2 theories, especially the first one, is there were attempts to find physical signatures of different emotions. If the James Lange theory is right, each emotion should have an identifiable pattern of bodily reactions, right? Because each emotion is marked by it. And for many emotions, this proved difficult. And so if you scan someone's heart rate or what have you, while they're experiencing different emotions, it's hard to distinguish them. And you can think about that intuitively. Think about what happens in your body when you're afraid versus excited. Kind of similar, right? Fast heart rate, etc. And physically that's true too. It's hard to distinguish them in that way. So this is where the 2-factor theory, also called the Schachter-Singer theory, comes in. So unsurprisingly, this theory posits 2 factors. The bodily reaction, and there's different terms you can use for the second factor, but you could call it the label, the cognitive interpretation, but whatever, the cognitive piece. These 2 together produce an emotion. So to make that concrete, suppose that you're walking home late at night and you hear footsteps behind you. Your heart rate will speed up. That's the bodily component. You turn around. If it's a wolf, you will interpret the fast heart rate as fear. If it's your friend, you will interpret it as you're pleasantly surprised to see your friend. So both these components together determine which emotion you're feeling. Yes?
Will we have to know these theories for the quiz?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Like I said, the big guideline is the key terms list. So the key terms is your guide for what to focus on. As I say, these three theories are historically important. They're kind of outdated, but I mean, the last one's important in that, you know, it was one of the first theories to emphasize the importance of the cognitive component, which is still accepted today. Any other questions about these three theories? So one thing I'll say that's connects to the last theory, there's a similar insight in cognitive therapy, that how you interpret things can influence which emotion you feel. That's really the foundation of cognitive therapy. It's easy to think that emotions just happen to us, that they're kind of outside of our control, but the success of cognitive therapy is predicated on the idea that changing what you believe or how you interpret things can affect which emotion you feel. As a kind of a fun example of the support for the last theory, at least it's helpful to interpret this study in terms of the third theory, I'm going to show a video of a study done here in Vancouver. I believe the footage is just a visual recreation of it, but originally it was done in Capilano. Okay, so here's how someone from the two-factor approach would explain that result. So you have the bodily reaction, right, the fast heart rate. You look around, there's an attractive woman, and you interpret the fast heart rate as extra, attraction to this person. I'm not suggesting that's the only way to explain the results. You can imagine other explanations, but that's how they would account for it. Okay, next we'll talk about some of the neuroscience related to emotion. There are a number of different brain regions involved. So I'll do a bad drawing of the brain. So for those of you who took 1100, what's the term for the outside, kind of bumpy looking part of the brain? The outside layer. I guess you all repressed the neuroscience information. So the cortex, the cerebral cortex. This is what the four lobes comprise. So as a general rule, if you want to remember what different parts of the brain do, the more to the outside and the more to the front a part of the brain is, the more evolutionarily recent it is. And generally the more complex and the more involved it is in complex processing. So you go to the outside of the frontal lobes, you get the most kind of distinctly human parts of the brain, most involved in long-term planning, complex reasoning, etc. You go to the middle and the back, you get to the medulla, it basically just makes your heart beat. It's basically just the spinal cord gets a bit thicker and now it's the brain. So dead simple. So that's a good general rule. So the outside part of the brain is more involved in conscious perception, conscious experience, and more careful thinking. One important part of the brain in the middle is the thalamus. So the thalamus's job is to be a relay center for sensory information. So all of the senses, except for smell cheats, but leaving smell aside, the other four senses go to the thalamus first, and the thalamus redirects them to different parts of the cortex to be processed more deeply. So vision, for example, will go to the thalamus and then to the occipital cortex at the back. The thalamus is like, okay, if you're visual information, you go to the back. If it's hearing related information, it will send it to the auditory cortex. So as far as the experience of emotion goes, many different brain regions are involved. It's tempting, and I succumb to this temptation too sometimes, to speak of emotion centers of the brain. That's probably not the best way to speak about it, but if you had to pick one region that's involved in emotion, it would be the amygdala. It's involved in a number of different emotions, but the emotions that where the link is most strongly established is emotions like fear and aggression. So, having laid this background out, this allows me to explain two different pathways, specifically for fear-type reactions. There's a fast pathway, or an unconscious pathway if you like, and a slow pathway. The fast pathway is thalamus to amygdala. The slow pathway is thalamus to cortex to amygdala. So again, fast is thalamus to amygdala. Slow is thalamus to cortex to amygdala. So how does this work? So remember, the thalamus's main job is to receive sensory information and send it to the cortex to be processed more deeply. The thalamus is, if you like, not that smart. I'm kind of personifying it a bit. It's a bit of poetic license, but it doesn't have a lot of complex processing ability. But it can do some rudimentary initial processing. So, for example, it can sometimes detect whether something is dangerous or not. It's sensitive to, for example, snake-like stimuli. So this is where the fast pathway comes in. What the thalamus can do is make an initial judgment in scare quotes, of course, that there's some kind of dangerous animal present, and send it to the amygdala. So sometimes you'll kind of like freak out about something, even before you've really figured out exactly what it is. Something kind of appears in the corner of your eye, and you're like, whoa. That would be the fast pathway in action. If you look at it more carefully and go, oh, it's a wolf. Wow, I'm really scared now. I know that's a wolf. Now the slow pathway has been activated. The thalamus has sent signals to the cortex. It's the visual cortex and other regions have processed it more carefully, and then it can reinforce that fear reaction. So that would be the slow pathway. Any questions about that distinction? Okay, some other parts of the brain involved in emotionally salient type responses. Don't worry about where these are, but I'll just kind of go through them. One important part is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus and thalamus have very different functions. They only have a similar name because they're spatially close. That's the only reason for the connection. The hypothalamus is kind of the boss of the endocrine system, or the hormone system. How many of you know the pituitary gland? So that's very close to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is basically the pituitary gland's boss. So, as a result, it's involved in many basic human motivations. There's a very bad neuroscience joke that's very helpful for remembering what the hypothalamus does. The hypothalamus is involved in motivations that relate to the 4 F's of survival. Feeding, so hunger, fleeing, fighting, and something else. So there you go. Easy to remember. If you were very sheltered, for the 4th one, sexual functioning. There you go. So that's something that the hypothalamus is involved in. For many emotions, most emotions in fact, so sadness, anger, happiness, we really want it to be the case that there's like one brain region that's like the sad part or something like that. That's typically not true. But in the case of disgust, there is a pretty tight link with one brain region, and that's the anterior insula. So I should say the hypothalamus. For F's, anterior insula, disgust. Another important part of the brain for a variety of different emotions, specifically positive emotions, is the nucleus accumbens. So, when you experience reward, so this could be really anything. So it could be you're eating your favorite food, taking a substance that you should not take, or what have you, and you have that kind of pleasure rush. This is undergirded by the nucleus accumbens sending dopamine everywhere. Dopamine's kind of the pleasure and reward neurotransmitter. So important for those kinds of experiences, and also for the forming of addictions. That's kind of the physical mechanism for it. And then a final neuroscience fact you should know has to do with left-right frontal asymmetry. When you measure relative activation of the left versus right frontal lobes, so you can do this with EEG, measure electrical activity in the two regions. People with relatively more active left frontal hemispheres compared to right tend to experience more positive or approach-oriented emotions. People with more relative right frontal activation tend to experience more negative or withdrawal type emotions. Of course, everything I'm saying is just on average, but that's something that neuroscientists have learned. Any questions about the neuroscience of emotion? Yep.
Could you repeat the last one?
Yeah, so just dead simple, if you want to remember, like this, more left activation, more positive emotion, more right activation, more negative emotion. Asymmetry just means difference, like not symmetrical, so not the same. Any other questions? Yep.
Does the asymmetry kind of explain why some people are more predisposed to depression and just experiencing more negative emotions?
Yeah, it could be a mechanism for it. So we do know that depression is somewhat heritable, less than some of the other disorders, but identical twins, for example, if one has depression, the other has a higher than average chance of getting depression. Now, I don't know if that's mediated by differences in this, but maybe someone's looked at that one. So you could look at Google Scholar later. It's a good question. Okay. As I've said, I'm very pro in-class questions. Okay. The next section is on emotional communication, and the biggest chunk of this section has to do with facial expressions. So for the human species, facial expression is a very important way that we communicate what emotion we're feeling. And there's a long-standing debate about facial expressions, namely, how universal are they? Are these just a product of cultural training, or are they innate and therefore universal? So the most important researcher in this area is someone named Paul Ekman. When Ekman was beginning his scientific career, a dominant view, particularly in anthropology, was that facial expressions were largely the product of culture, and therefore they could vary widely between different cultures. Ekman put this to the test in a very interesting way. He found a example of a pre-literate culture in the highlands of Papua New Guinea. They had been living the same way for thousands of years. Found one person who could speak Pidgin, which Ekman knew a bit of, and used this person as a translator. I believe in the video he says more. I think it was a boy who went to a missionary school nearby, but most of the people had no exposure to the outside world. And Ekman just asked them, suppose you experienced, a child dying, what face would you make? And they make the face. What would you do if you're ready to fight? They went through a number of different emotionally, the types of experiences that would produce different emotions, and found that at least for 6 emotions, there was evidence that these people had the same facial expressions that you find anywhere else in the world. These are sometimes referred to as the 6 core basic emotions. So the 6 are happiness, sadness, anger, fear, surprise, and disgust. In the specific case of disgust, there's a pretty plausible evolutionary story to tell about maybe how it emerged. When you think about what the face looks like, you can even make it. What would you make if you smelled smelly garbage? Your eyes crinkle, your nose crinkles, and you stick your tongue out. All of which are kind of let stuff in here and get stuff out of my mouth. So there's maybe that's conjectural, but you could tell an evolutionary story about that. So I'll actually show a video of Ekman discussing this experiment. You'll see some pictures of some of the original subjects. Okay, so well said by Ekman. So brilliant study, kind of a classic in psychology. Now, he mentions in that video that this does not apply to things like gestures, right? The fact that this means good, or as he says, even that this means yes. Those are cultural artifacts, but he argues that facial expressions, at least these core ones, are human universals. Now, Ekman still recognized that culture had an influence, and he categorized or talked about cultural influence in terms of display rules. What the culture gives you is the rules for when it's appropriate or not appropriate to display different emotions. So some cultures have stricter rules about when you can show emotions. So one example that's often cited is Japan, where particularly if you're near an authority figure, you are supposed to not express your emotions. That would be an example of a display rule, which would be a cultural artifact. So this is kind of the standard view now in the intro psych textbooks, is Ekman's view. But for the sake of fairness, and also to introduce the next topic, I will note there's a very eminent neuroscientist today who is skeptical that emotional expression is as innate and universal as Ekman claims, and that's Lisa Feldman Barrett. And who knows? Science changes. Maybe in 40 years, the intro psych textbooks will have her. So I read her account of the Ekman experiment that Ekman just talked about. I thought it was a bit of a stretch, but she has other lines of data that she points to. And I'll show a video of her that is relevant to the next section, which is, it's often important to look at context in order to understand different facial expressions. Sometimes the exact same facial expression can mean something else in a different context. This is one line of evidence that Barrett points to argue that emotions are not as straightforward as Ekman claims. So I'll show that video and then move on to the next topic. Okay, so those illustrate the importance of context in interpreting facial expression, and the book has some similar visual examples. Okay, any questions about Ekman or Barrett? Okay, oh yeah, I have a picture I forgot to show. I'm sure many of you have seen the movie Inside Out. How many of you have seen this movie? So Ekman actually worked on this movie. He was a consultant with the producers, and pretty close to what he thinks. I mean, obviously he doesn't think there's little people in there, but he does think there are these discrete, different, innate emotional responses. Another finding that relates to facial expressions is support for the facial feedback hypothesis. This should be on the key terms. The facial feedback hypothesis is that if your face is forced to make a particular facial expression, in other words, it's not genuine, it's not flowing from the emotion, that can still cause you to feel the emotion. You can think of it as a fake it till you make it kind of thing. These pictures come from a study where people are randomly assigned to two conditions. In one, they are told to balance the pencil like this, and it kind of forces you to make a kind of frowny face. The others are forced to bite it, which kind of forces you to smile a little bit. And then you give them different tasks, like reading comics, and people in the biting condition find the comics more funny, or report finding the comics more funny. So that would be evidence that forcing people to have this expression does cause them to feel more of the associated emotion. So, nothing too fancy there. Next, we'll talk about lying, and something I'm sure many of you are interested in, lie detector tests, as they're sometimes called. More strictly, we should call them polygraph tests. So, you would have learned in 1100 that there's something called the sympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for the fight or flight response. So, leads to faster heart rate, dilated pupils, various other responses. They're sort of preparing the body for threat. So this would have evolved to help us deal with things like bears or tigers. So your body does things like it stops digesting food, it stops worrying about fighting diseases. All energy goes to kind of the muscles, heart, lungs, gets you ready to run away from the bear or fight it if need be. If you want a way to remember that that's the sympathetic one, you can remember evolution was nice to us. Sympathetic also means nice, and it helped us run away from bears. That's how I remembered it in undergrad. The other one, which I don't believe is on the key terms, but for whatever it's worth, the other one is called the parasympathetic. That's the kind of relax, rest, back to default settings. So, as you'll see in the video, the polygraph has a number of different things designed to measure the degree of sympathetic nervous system activation. So there's something that measures galvanic skin response, heart rate, breathing, and essentially what these are measuring is nervousness, right? Kind of how nervous do you feel? And this is correlated with dishonesty. In most people, lying makes you kind of perk up a bit. You're a little uncomfortable, afraid of getting caught. And so you can measure how much more nervous or how much more sympathetic nervous system activity they have compared to baseline. 4 different answers. This is correlated with dishonesty, but not strongly enough to use in a court of law. As I'm sure many of you know, the polygraph is not admissible as evidence in court because there the standard is proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and it's nowhere near that, but it's better than a coin flip. You do gain some predictive accuracy if you use the polygraph. It does have some specific weaknesses. One that's well known and relevant to a disorder we'll talk about later. Some people just don't get nervous when they lie. I'm speaking of more psychopaths. Psychopaths generally actually hard to make them nervous at all, but someone who's a pathological liar, they can pass the polygraph no problem. There's a famous case in the United States of a serial killer who was a psychopath who was brought in for questioning and actually given a polygraph. He passed, so they thought, oh, they ruled him out as a suspect. Later turned out, there's overwhelming evidence that it was him. So I'll show a video of a police officer using it. Now, he maybe sells it a bit too much. He uses words like confirm, that's too strong, but his account of how the polygraph actually works is pretty good. So we'll also see a video of him using it on someone. Okay, so that's all I have to say about the polygraph test. And that brings us to the end of the section on emotion. The next half or so of the chapter is on motivation. Any questions on the first half of the book? Okay, let's take 15. We'll take a little more than 15. I'm still feeling a bit under the weather. So 10:45, let's come back then. Okay, let's keep moving. So the next half of the chapter is on motivation. And I think it's not an accident that the chapter is on both emotion and motivation. Both terms have their etymological roots in the word to move, the equivalent to move. So both of them have to do with the ways in which certain psychological states get us to do things. That's what both emotions and motivations are for. In fact, my professor in Georgia State University, who taught me the course on emotion, developed a whole theory called the motivational theory of emotion. That was kind of his area of specialization. And the section starts off with the roots of motivation in our evolutionary past. One way to think about it is take hunger as a basic motivation. Suppose there was an organism that had a mutation that made it just not get hungry all that often. It didn't really like food. That organism did not spread its genes, right? If you don't like food, you're not making it. You're not going to live long enough to mate and have descendants. We are the descendants of people who liked food. And you can extend that kind of analysis to a lot of human motivations. I'm going to show a video from the philosopher Dan Dennett talking about the evolutionary basis of our motivations. Dennett was a great philosopher, actually passed away just less than a year ago. But this is, I think, a helpful video to start off the section on motivation. Okay, so that's well said. He goes on to spell out the beginnings of an evolutionary theory of the origin of humor. You don't have to worry about that for the test, but for whatever it's worth, Dennett argues that humor is essentially a reward for engaging in debugging. So this is a coding term where you have to find errors or problems in the code. And a lot of humor relates to incongruence or the violation of expectations, right? That's punchlines to jokes are usually unexpected. So Dennett conjectures, and this is conjectural, that because humor is rewarding, and we find something unexpected, it gives us pleasure, and evolution usually, makes things pleasurable when they serve some kind of important purpose. And he conjectures that that's the purpose they're designed for, is detecting errors in assumptions. There's a different evolutionary conjecture actually in the book in 1100, which is that, and these may both have some truth to them, the other conjecture is that it's for essentially play fighting. So chimps do something kind of like laughing if they are engaged in play fighting as juveniles, and in that context, it's a signal that I know we're not really fighting. Like, I'm enjoying this, we can keep going. And in social relationships, that's often true too. A lot of humor is kind of ribbing, poking fun, and if both sides are laughing, it's a cue that I'm not actually attacking you. We're engaged in kind of verbal play fighting. As I say, don't worry about that for the test, but if you're curious where he was going with that, those are kind of the standard two evolutionary conjectures. So the book goes on to talk about the term instinct, which relates to what Dan was talking about. So an instinct is a evolutionarily programmed behavioral pattern. And there's a long-standing debate in psychology about how many instincts we have. So at one extreme, there's the behaviorists, who you would have learned a lot about in 1100 if you took it, the behaviorists thought that we were essentially blank slates, that we have few, if any, instincts, and that the patterns in behavior that we engage in are the result of conditioning from the environment. So they would be at one extreme, arguing we have very few instincts. Some people in the evolutionary psychology tradition would be maybe close to the other end of the spectrum, where they think the human mind is like a Swiss Army knife. If you read evolutionary psychologists, they'll often use that metaphor, that the brain or the mind has a number of specific mechanisms for specific types of problems. So they conjecture that we have, pre-programmed mental modules is their term, modules for things like cheater detection, for finding a mate, for different types of jealousy. All of those would be separate instincts, if you like. So you don't have to worry about which side of the debate you fall on, but that's a long-standing debate in psychology. Okay, how are these instincts realized? Well, one theory relates to drives, sometimes called drive reduction theory. According to this theory, the goal that the body is programmed with is to achieve homeostasis. How many of you have heard the term homeostasis, like in a biology class or something? Yeah, so homeostasis is kind of a neutral state where your needs are met, everything's in equilibrium, and that's where your body wants to be. What drives are is they're unpleasant internal states that are caused by some kind of physical need. So when you're in a state of hunger, that would be a drive. It's an unpleasant state. You feel that aching in your stomach, and it motivates you to seek food. And once you have enough food, you have reached homeostasis. So perfect homeostasis would be you're warm, full, have enough water, etc. A different way of conceptualizing human motivation is in terms of seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. This isn't necessarily incompatible, but it's a kind of different way of talking about motivations. So the hedonic principle is the idea that people are motivated to seek pleasure and avoid pain. I didn't say this to my Monday 1200 class, but this reminds me of actually a line from Dennett, who we just saw. Dennett has kind of a mean joke, but I was a psych major, so I'm allowed to make this joke. Dennett says, why are psych majors less bright? And his explanation was, in an intro psych class like this, the prof will say things like, people are motivated to seek pleasure and avoid pain. 95% of the class goes, oh, that's obvious, I already knew that. And then 5% goes, that's genius, and then they major in psychology. I may edit that part out in case the department sees this one. But anyway, so this is the idea that we are motivated to seek pleasure and avoid pain. And if you play the game of asking yourself, why do I do what I do? And keep asking, very often that is where you'll land. So, I could ask all of you, why are you taking this class? And presumably most of you are going to say, well, I want to finish a degree. And if I then ask, well, why do you want to finish a degree? You'll probably say, well, I want to make more money. And if I say, why do you want to make more money? You'll say, well, I'd like to have a house or maybe a small one-bedroom apartment because it's Vancouver. I want some form of housing. Well, why do you want housing? Well, I don't want to sleep outside. Why not? Well, it's cold. That's not good. I say, why don't you want to be cold? And you'll say, well, it's painful, it's unpleasant. And if I then ask, why do you not want to feel pain? You're not going to be able to say, it just sucks. No further answers, right? So that is often where motivations bottom out, is seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. Okay, I've gone through a few terms. Any questions on anything I've said? The next term maybe could have been put in the emotion half of the chapter, but I'll go in order. The next term is emotion regulation, which is exactly what it sounds like. These are different strategies we have for influencing our emotions. Typically, we want to do it in the way that makes us feel more positive emotion. There are different examples you'll see in the literature. Two of the book talks about are suppression and reappraisal. Suppression is, again, what it sounds like. This is sort of pushing down unpleasant emotions, trying to kind of block them from awareness, or at least not allowing yourself to express them. Another, probably healthier one, is reappraisal. So remember earlier that appraisal is kind of a cognitive term. It has to do with how you evaluate or think about some situation. So reappraisal is changing the way you think, or changing what you believe about something. Won't go into too much detail here, but as I think I've already mentioned, this is similar to cognitive therapy, right, where you change how you think about something in order to change how you feel about it. You know, this would be the classic, you know, there's something unpleasant and you practice not thinking about it as a threat, but thinking about it as an opportunity. You know, that would be a classic example of reappraisal. Okay, another term that's relevant here, that's listed in the key terms, is the relationship between arousal and performance. So again, arousal here doesn't mean just sexual arousal, it just means heightened state. And there's a well-replicated finding that the relationship between arousal and performance, like how well you do at something, is different depending on whether it's an easy task or a hard task. Or if you like, a well-practiced task or a not well-practiced task. For a hard task, or a task that you've not practiced very much, you want to be mediumly aroused. That's kind of the optimal. If you're under-aroused, you won't do very well, and if you're over-aroused, you also won't do very well. So let's say it's a difficult test. One type of arousal is nervousness or anxiety. What this would mean is, if you're not anxious at all, like you're just like, oh, I don't really give a shit, man, you know, you will not do very well. And if you're over-aroused, if you're too nervous, that will make you mess up. So you want that optimal middle. For an easy task, basically more arousal is better, you know, up to a certain point. So you want to be highly aroused if you want to do the best. So here's an example that may help. So even if you're not like a skilled runner, all of you presumably know how to run. It's something you've done since you were a kid. You just put one foot in front of the other. It's pretty simple, what you have to do. How many of you know how to juggle? Okay, no, so I don't either. Suppose I gave you like a 1-hour lesson on juggling, and then I asked you to juggle in front of this class. Probably having to do it in front of the class would make you nervous, and you'll probably do worse at that new thing you don't really know how to do. But let's say instead I had the class watch you run. Probably you'd run faster. You know how to run, it's pretty straightforward. The extra pressure would probably make you feel more aroused and therefore do better. Next, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maslow is a humanistic psychologist. We'll see more about the humanists in the therapy chapter. So Maslow conceptualized human motivation as being a kind of pyramid, where the lowest motivations are the most basic, and if they are not met, they take first priority. Once they are met, you start moving up the hierarchy. So at the bottom is physiological needs for things like warmth, food, water, etc. And the idea is if those aren't met, the middle one is belongingness and love. If you're starving to death, you're not going to think, I wish I had more friends. It's not going to be really on your mind. So physiological needs is first, next is safety and security. Belonging, and you should know the order. Belongingness and love is the middle one. Now, keep this distinct in your head from esteem. You might think those are the same thing, but belongingness and love is being liked. Esteem is being respected. People, thinking highly of you, having some status. And these are distinct, and as an example to help you remember, most of you probably know that every friend group has one person that everyone likes, but everyone also thinks is an idiot. And if your friend group doesn't have someone like that, that means it's you. So, sorry to tell you. That's one way in which those two come apart. For Maslow, the end goal is self-actualization. That's the final step. Self-actualization is achieving your unique potential. Okay. Any questions on Maslow's hierarchy? Okay, next we'll talk about a few specific motivations. There's a section on hunger and then a section on sexual motivation. So two, obviously, central motivations for mammals. So some boring technical stuff for hunger. You should know the two main hormones involved. There are others as well, but the two that the book talks about are ghrelin and leptin. Ghrelin is produced by the stomach, and it's involved in the experience of hunger. If you want to remember that, ghrelin kind of sounds like growling. Just think like your stomach's growling. There you go, that's for free. Leptin is produced by fat cells, and it leads to the feeling of satiation, so feeling full. You'll remember that I mentioned that the hypothalamus is involved in the 4 F's of survival, one of which is feeding, so hunger. Different parts of the hypothalamus have different roles vis-a-vis hunger. The lateral hypothalamus is involved in generating the feeling of hunger. The ventromedial hypothalamus is involved in the generation of feeling satiated or full. And again, as a gift, here's a little memorization trick. The way we know this is if you destroy parts of these parts of the brain in animals, you can see it reflected in their behavior. If you destroy this in a mouse, the mouse will stop eating or not eat very much. Whereas if you destroy this, they will eat a lot. They never feel satisfied. So that's where the memorization trick comes from. Just remember what happens when they are destroyed. So make sure you don't mix this up. But when this part of the brain is destroyed, you lack hunger, LH. When this part of the brain is destroyed, you become very hungry, VH. So therefore, when it's normally functioning, obviously it's doing the opposite. This one's making you feel hungry, and this one's making you feel full. Okay, there's a section on eating disorders. Many of these will probably be, you'll have heard these in other classes. The first is binge eating disorder. These are people who go through recurrent periods of overeating. So a large amount of calories in a short period of time. bulimia, which is, again, periods of binge eating, but they're followed by some kind of compensatory behavior. The most common is inducing vomiting, right, making yourself throw up after the big meal. Others would be laxatives or excessive exercise. Those would all technically still fall under the bulimia umbrella. How many of you know Seinfeld? Any of you watch Seinfeld? There's an episode where George suspects that his girlfriend is bulimic, and he's kind of like freaking out about it. And his friend says, "Oh, so you're concerned?" And he says, "Of course I'm concerned. I'm paying for those meals." If you know George, he's not the most selfless person. The last one, more serious note. I mean, all these are serious, of course, but anorexia nervosa. This is people who are kind of obsessed with body weight and reduce their food intake to the point where they're severely underweight. Very serious, as I say, because the risk of death is very high compared to most other disorders. Around 10% of people diagnosed with anorexia will die from it on average. So, very serious condition. I mean, if you stop eating, eventually the body stops working. So the book mentions there's a pretty large cultural component with these, particularly anorexia. So there's a lot of cultural variability in terms of how much thinness is prized. Even within Western culture, that's changed over time. So in cultures that don't value that as much, you tend not to see this disorder. Okay, the next section talks about obesity. So obesity is defined by convention as having a BMI of over 30, BMI meaning body mass index. This is calculated through reference to a ratio of your height to weight. You can Google it, it's easy to calculate. It's not a perfect measure, it's somewhat flawed. It doesn't take into account things like muscle mass or body shape. So for example, how many of you know Brock Lesnar? Big jacked guy. Technically he's obese if you use the BMI cutoff, but if you look him up, that seems pretty silly. So it's a good first pass, but not a perfect measure. So obesity, this won't surprise you, has gone up a lot in recent decades in the developed world. And different explanations you could put forward. One term that the book uses that's nice is evolutionary mismatch. Forgot to mention this to my Monday class, but it's a good term to know. This refers to a mismatch between the environment we are in now and the environment in which we evolved. So our bodies were designed by evolution to stay alive in a context of scarcity. Right, Dennett talked about this when he talked about our preference for sugar, right? We have an instinctive preference for high energy food because if food is scarce, you might as well have a preference for the high energy foods. So we evolved in Africa, in the grasslands of Africa. So having a preference for whatever berries or sweets you could find was adaptive there. But in the modern world, where we can produce it en masse, having that instinctive preference for sugar is not good for us anymore. There's a paradox related to obesity, and it's similar to a paradox we'll see in the chapter on IQ scores. Obesity, or I should just say weight, is substantially heritable. If you trust the estimates that come from, say, twin studies, the number you get is something like 50 to 70% of the variation in weight is explainable in terms of genes. So identical twins are very similar in weight, and they are significantly more similar than non-identical twins. So if you do the math with that using the standard models, that's the estimate you come up with. Having said that, though, the large increase in obesity over the last, say, century can't be due to genes. right? We don't evolve that quickly. This is solely due to changes in the environment, having to do with the availability of junk food and other variables. So here's the way to think about that. Imagine two curves. So the curve at, say, 1900 and the curve today. Those heritability numbers, the numbers that give you an estimate of what percentage of the variation is due to genes, those are about differences between people at any given time. So there's a range of weight in the modern world, let's say in Canada. The heritability numbers are about how much of the differences between people today are due to genes. And the number you get is something like 50 to 70%. But that doesn't mean that the difference between the curve today and the curve 100 years ago is due to genes. That difference, the difference between the curve today and the curve 100 years ago, is solely due to differences in the environment. We'll return to this issue in the chapter on intelligence, but any questions about what I just said? Okay, a kind of depressing concept that comes out of research into obesity is the idea of the set point. The idea here is over time your body settles on a particular weight and tries to maintain it. Again, think of our evolutionary past. Keeping on some weight can be adaptive if you don't know for sure there's going to be food later on. The way this plays itself out, if you start to fall below the set point, you start to, say, lose weight, your body will actually decrease its metabolism in an effort to maintain that weight. So metabolism is, of course, the rate at which your body burns calories. So if your weight starts to go down, your body will decrease how quickly it burns energy. Okay. Any questions on the hunger section? Okay, so the next section is on sexual desire. So again, think about what I said about food, right? Any organism that had no preference for food, no instinctive tendency towards hunger, they didn't spread their genes. The same is true for sexual desire. Any organism that had genes that made it think, sex, that seems kind of boring. I'm just going to eat berries and stuff. They did not leave any descendants. So we are the descendants of organisms that had a preference for sex. I remember I was talking with a friend once and I asked, why do you think sex feels good? And they said, I think it feels good because it's good exercise. There is no chance that that's true. And if you think that's true, if you have a romantic partner, if you try rubbing your elbows together or something, it will still be good exercise, or at least as good exercise, but it will not feel good, obviously. So there's something special about the way sex feels because it facilitates reproduction. Now, I'll note as an aside, some of you may be thinking, what about homosexual attraction? We don't cover that in this course. In 1100, there's a section on homosexuality in which I talk about some different evolutionary hypotheses, but we don't cover that in this course. So here we have to talk again about hormones, and we have to talk about a distinction between two different effects that specifically sex hormones have. One is organizational effects, which have to do with building the body, especially in the womb, and the other is activational effects, which have to do with facilitating sex, sexual desire and sexual behavior on a day-to-day basis. So I'll start with organizational. So here's the key thing to know. the default of the fetal body is to become female. Absent the introduction of male sex hormones like testosterone, another term for male sex hormone is androgens. If there are no androgens introduced, the body will develop to be female. So the sex organs start out the same as kind of neutral. So for example, for whatever it's worth, like the penis and clitoris are the same organ. It's just that when testosterone is introduced, the developmental trajectories diverge. One of the reasons we know this is an interesting disorder called androgen insensitivity syndrome. These are people who have XY chromosomes, so they have male DNA, male typical DNA, but their bodies do not process testosterone. Remember, androgen is a heading for male sex hormones. So because of this, the body goes through the default developmental trajectory of becoming female. So the baby's born, nothing looks awry, it looks like a typical female. When they grow up, if you were to meet someone with this disorder, at least in the extreme cases, high-pitched voice, wide hips, breasts, like you would never suspect anything. They notice something's wrong when they don't have their periods. So where the ovaries should be, there are in fact testicles. That's the way in which they still are characteristically XY. So that is an example of the fact that it's testosterone that masculinizes the fetal body. There are some cases of almost the reverse, where you have an XX person, someone with female typical DNA, but too much testosterone is released, and you may get a case of kind of ambiguous genitalia somewhere in the middle. So that's organizational. Activational, as I say, has to do with causing sexual desire and sexual behavior. For females, the hormones involved fluctuate over the course of the menstrual cycle. For males, they are more constant. And testosterone actually plays a role for both sexes here. So both males and females obviously have sexual desire, and both have testosterone. Males just have more of it. And while it's not necessarily the only hormone involved in sexual desire for women, there is evidence that sex drives are associated with testosterone levels in females as well. So the book has a discussion of that. Any questions about this distinction? Okay, next, one of the weirder studies done in the history of psychology, although very important, was done by Masters and Johnson. Probably something you wouldn't get away with today with the ethics boards, but it was all voluntary. They had couples come into the lab, they hooked up their bodies to various measuring instruments, and the couples made love on some table or something in the lab, and they uncovered a pretty standard pattern of sexual response. This is called the human sexual response cycle, and it's good to know the order. So the first stage is excitement, so when the act is beginning. This is when the heart rate increases, blood flows to the genitals, having various consequences. So that's stage one. Stage two is plateau, where the degree of sexual arousal stays constant, so it stays high as the act is occurring. And then there is orgasm, and then resolution, where the body goes back to normal. So those are the 4 stages. For males, there's kind of a 4-part 2, 4A if you like, which is the refractory period. The refractory period, its length will change as you get older, but could be several minutes or it could be a matter of hours. This is a period in which you cannot begin the sexual response cycle again. You cannot, for example, have another orgasm. Females can potentially have multiple orgasms one after the other. Evolution is unfair. But that's what the refractory period is. In terms of the underlying physiology, the peak, so orgasm, is characterized by rhythmic muscle contractions as well as the release of dopamine in the brain, which we talked about earlier. Dopamine being the pleasure or reward chemical. Okay. Any questions about the sexual response cycle? Good. Okay. Next section. So the next section distinguishes between two types of motivation. This could affect many different areas. So the distinction is between intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is where you do something because you like doing it. You're not doing it for the expectation of reward or trying to avoid punishment. You're doing it because you like it. So for me, when I teach, at least if I'm not teaching an evening class, I do it out of intrinsic motivation. I enjoy teaching. The evening class, like the 6:30 one on Monday, maybe there I'm doing it to avoid getting fired. But, well, I suppose even in other cases I have some degree of both. Extrinsic would mean doing it because of reward. So if you're doing your job, doing it to get paid, or as I say, to avoid being fired. Related term is the over-justification effect. So you can think of this as kind of a three-step process. Step one being you feel intrinsically motivated to do something, but then you start getting rewarded for it, and this causes your motivation to become extrinsic. You start to care more about the reward, and then if the reward stops, you'll stop doing the thing because your motivation is no longer intrinsic. So, a famous study on this, I don't know if it's been replicated or not, but they looked at kids playing in a sandbox. There was a group of kids playing in the sandbox every lunch. So at the beginning, they're intrinsically motivated. No one's paying them to do it, excuse me, or anything else. And then the teachers start paying them $1 every time they play in the sandbox. And then once the teachers stopped paying them, they stopped playing in the sandbox. Which when you think about it is kind of strange because at first they're doing it for free, but sometimes reward can have this effect of causing the motivation to be more extrinsic. If you just think about the term, so over justification, like you're giving too much reason for the thing. They were already motivated enough, adding extra can have this effect. Okay, next, before I introduce the next term, I'll do a little poll. Suppose I offer you the following bet. You can come up to me after class and I will flip a coin. If I flip heads, I will give you $100. If I flip tails, you will give me $80. Show of hands, who would be interested in this bet? It's more than my Monday class, but still a minority. So, and that's typical. Most people say they would not want to do this. Now, if you think in strict kind of economic utility maximizing terms, most of us, I wouldn't take this either, most of us are irrational. Because this is actually a pretty good, the odds are well, not the odds are in your favor, but the expected utility is good. Our aversion to things like this is called loss aversion. Losing something feels more bad than gaining something feels good. This principle generalizes beyond economics. In terms of positive and negative emotion, it's typically the case that negative emotion can go more bad than positive emotion can be good. Now, the fact that I said that first may bias you, but just think about this as if I hadn't said that. Imagine that a genie appeared to you and gave you the following deal. So first, think about the best day in your life. Just remember what that was like. And now try to think, what was the worst day of your life? Remember what that was like. So the genie gives you this deal. I will let you relive moment by moment the best day of your life, but in exchange, you have to first relive the worst day of your life. Show of hands, who wants this deal? So one person, or two people. So that's pretty typical. Usually most say no, and that's consistent with this general principle. Again, there's a kind of evolutionary logic here. From the gene's eye view, things can go more badly than they can go well. So from the gene's eye view, the best case scenario is you live long enough to reproduce and you ensure that your offspring can also reproduce. So you do the sorts of things that lead to procreation, you have the baby, so amazing. But that's only provisionally good, right? The baby could get eaten by a lion, right? It's not a guarantee. So even the good things are only provisionally good. But if you get eaten by a lion, which is I guess the worst case scenario, that's it. You are now out of the evolutionary contest. So you could conjecture that our nervous systems are sort of designed to intuitively recognize that things can go much worse than they can go well. Okay, just a few more terms. Looks like we'll finish with some time left over. When it comes to dividing up emotions or motivations, one way of doing it that biologists like is talking about approach versus avoidance motivation. This has some advantages over talking about positive versus negative emotion because it's easier to operationalize behaviorally, to just look at what the animals do. So approach motivation means a motivation that gets you to move towards something. Most of these would be characteristically positive emotions, but it would also include something like anger, right? Anger motivates you to move towards something. Avoidance motivations are typically negative, so these would be like fear, sadness. They motivate you to withdraw from something. Using this, you can talk about different sorts of motivational conflicts. And I'll keep it really simple with a concrete example. Suppose that your parents kick you out for the night, something you did, and there's two places you can crash. There's party A and party B. So there's the situation in which you like party A, don't like party B, don't like party A, like party B, don't like party B. So I don't know. So in this scenario, let's say party A has your crush, whatever. So if you want to go to party A but you don't want to go to party B, there's no conflict. Right here, there's no conflict. Same with here. If you like one and don't like the other, there's no conflict. You'll just go to the one you like. If you like both party A and party B, so party A has your crush, party B has your best friend, that would be an approach conflict. if party B has your X and party A has your enemy, whatever, that would be an avoidance conflict. And then not using this 2 by 2, an approach avoidance conflict would be, for example, there's one party that you could go to or not go to, and it has some people you like and some people you don't like. You're unsure of whether to go. And in theory, you could have more than one case like that, but that's what an approach avoidance conflict would be. Okay, any questions on that? Okay, just one more term, and then we're done for the day. Oh, and I forgot to say this at the beginning, but this Friday in N2201 is the test review day. For this class, it's 2:30 p.m., so I guess that's tomorrow. So if you have a chance between today and tomorrow, try going through the key terms list, kind of test yourself, see if you have any outstanding questions, and then you can either ask them on course questions or come to test review day tomorrow. If you can't make it to that, it will be filmed and put on the YouTube playlist. So the final term for today is terror management theory. This theory grows out of the Freudian tradition. So Freud thought that you could reduce all of human motivation basically to one, which was sexual motivation. For Freud, everything is about sex. The terror management people say, look, Freud was right that there is a lot of repression and defense mechanisms, but it's not about sex, it's about the fear of death. They thought that was the central human motivation, was coping with the fear of death. Unlike other animals, we are intelligent. We can think about our goals and think about where they'll lead. And again, unlike the other animals, we know that one day our goals will come to nothing because we're all going to die. And we don't like this fact, so we come up with various ways of dealing with this terror related to our own mortality. So one obvious way in which we do this, they said, is religion. They believe that religion is a way of coping with the fear of death. But they thought it also applied to different secular worldviews. So, things like being patriotic about your country or sticking to your guns with your political doctrine, that what these are is they're ways of achieving symbolic immortality. So I may not live on, but my nation will live on, or my ideology will live on. And they thought that even worldviews like that are rooted in the fear of death. The way they would test this experimentally is they'd get people into the lab and randomly assign them to different conditions. In one, they would be made more aware of death. Maybe you have to read a passage about how we're all going to die, and then there'd be a control condition. And then you have questions like, how committed are you to your political worldview, your religious worldview? And they found that being in the death awareness condition led to higher rankings, more fervent conviction about politics or religion. Now, there's been some debate about that in the aftermath of the replication crisis, so a bit of a question mark there, but it's an interesting and influential idea in social psychology. Any questions about that term? Okay, I'll stick around if you have questions. See some of you on Friday and the rest of you on Thursday for the test. Oh, and please bring a pencil and your student ID. Okay, so my sickness caused me to forget. I'm sure all of you will be very happy to hear this. So I will tell you what the written question will be. If I ever forget on the class before a test where there's a written, just remind me so I can tell you all. So the written question will be about the following. I will describe a positive correlation I will just name two variables and say, imagine these two variables are positively correlated. Your first task will be to explain why we can't infer from that one causes the other. So review what I said about that. Your next task will be to describe how you would set up an experiment to test whether one variable causes the other. So this is very important to how psychological research is done, so that's what the question will be about. Okay, now you can go.